إذن ضيوفنا الكرام نعود لاستكمال أعمال المؤتمر في يومه الثاني. نقف الآن مع كلمة بعنوان شراكات لوجستية عابرة للحدود نحو تكامل إقليمي وعالمي، يقدمها الأستاذ جرانت سوانبويل مسؤول التحالفات العالمية في جمعية إدارة سلاسل الامداد.
There's a presentation on now. Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. As I was thinking through this topic, complexity to clarity, building resilient and ROI-driven supply chains for the Middle East of the future, I thought this is actually quite a complex topic. And I was speaking to my friend Shireen earlier, and I was saying to her, when we think about supply chains, either I'm a really simplistic person, where I try and make things very simple, or I'm really clever. I don't know which one it is yet. But when I think of this topic, what I really wanted to do here is to give us a structure as we dive into the concept of resilience and risk management, and we think about how that has evolved in recent times. It's really interesting for me to see that companies are employing different strategies now. We're not thinking about risk management as an exception, we're thinking about it as the norm. And this is changing the whole operating model that companies are working on. We'll also talk about trends in supply chain management, the Association for Supply Chain Management, where I come from. We do an annual report. We analyze the trends out there in the market. We get insights from academics, we get insights from organizations, and we try to understand what the latest trends are. The reason why we need to know that is because we want to anticipate how to adjust and make changes in our supply chains to react or to be prepared for the trends that we see coming. The next thing that I want to talk about will be strategic alignment and how we translate that into an operating model. Here, I will touch on the SCORE framework, the Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, which, in my opinion, is one of the most prolific frameworks that you can have in supply chain, connecting process, practice, people, and performance, and how we can do that most effectively. I also want to talk and dive into a little bit of the operating model component of this. A lot of supply chains, over time, develop organically, right? We have a warehouse, and then we need more capacity, and we get another warehouse. We add a few more vehicles, we add a new product line, and it develops organically. But what if you could look from a high-level perspective at your supply chain, develop a strategy, and build a supply chain from scratch? The other component that relates to strategy is when an organization talks about their supply chain, what they're usually talking about is their supply chains. We don't just have one supply chain. We have many different supply chains in some cases with different strategic objectives. You don't go into a store and it's a one-size-fits-all jacket. You buy the size that fits you. And this is exactly how supply chains also operate. And then another topic that I'd like to finish off with is benefit statements. This might sound very operational, but it's so important to connect the metric and the KPI to what we want to achieve. And the activities that we do in our supply chains need to add value. So this is what I want to close off in the session with. But first, let me talk a little bit about the evolution of risk management as a concept. Traditionally, risk management was analytical and reactive. We would identify the key risks, look at what could happen or what has occurred, and try to make plans to mitigate those risks. When we think about the concept of resilience or resilient supply chains, we're thinking more structural, we're thinking more proactive. We're building the blocks that are going to help us to prepare and weather the storms of risk that occurs. And we'll get into the risks in a moment, don't worry. We'll go through all of those as the usual risks that we talk about in the VUCA world that we live in. We want to design the supply chain to withstand and absorb and continue operating under that disruption. In the past, it was about the risk occurring, and then after the risk has occurred, we're going to go and fix it, right? Now it's about working within the constraints of that risk or of those issues happening in our supply chain. Things like global geopolitics, price increases, unexpected weather events, and those kinds of things are all very common examples in this day and age. My most important takeout from this slide is really the view of the disruption. In the past, and in many companies we still see this, where risk was viewed as an exception. It's something that we need to mitigate. But actually, we want to be operating as an expected operating condition with that in mind. So we expect risk to happen. We don't separate it or exclude it from our strategies. In terms of the nature of the actions we would take, in traditional risk management, we're thinking about things like policies, controls, how are we going to do mitigation plans where we can mitigate those risks. We'll look at the impact of the risk and how frequently or how probability it's going to happen. What is the probability of it going to happen? When we think about resilience, we're now going to develop a network or a design in our supply chain with the right buffers, with the right places of inventory to mitigate that risk. This is why we're seeing the advent of, we know just in time as an inventory policy, and that was really pushed for a very long time, and to an extent I still believe some of that, but actually the just-in-case model is making a huge comeback, right? Part of that reason is because we're less able to predict demand like we were in the past. There's a lot of spikes that could happen, maybe even from a demand or supply side. So for that reason, we're seeing a bit of a shift in the way we see inventory and the usage of inventory, instead of it just being let's just reduce it as much as possible. When we think about traditional risk management, we're also talking about the dependency on prediction, where in traditional risk management, we had a high dependency on saying, yeah, these are the list of risks that we can have, and these are the things we can do about that. But remember COVID, no one had COVID on their risk register at that time. We didn't predict that. So what's more important is to make some assumptions around not all risk can be predicted. But what we can do is understand the impact of that. A lot of the time, the risk that we see is causing issues on the supply side, not being able to get the stock that we need, or the demand side where we don't have enough capacity to fulfill demand to customers. But we can develop playbooks to solve that problem. In terms of measuring risk, from a traditional perspective, it was about risk exposure, how frequent incidents happened, and also the loss or the size of the loss that would occur. Now we're looking more at agility. How long does it take us to recover from an unanticipated spike in demand? What can we do from a service continuity perspective and measure that? And also the cost of that. The outcome of traditional risk management was about reducing exposure. Now we're saying, let's look at sustained performance under the stress that we are now coming across. From an executive perspective, protection and governance was the key topic when we thought about risk management and our risk registers that we did once a year. Now it's about continuity, having confidence in our supply chains, and also competitive advantage. I was saying this to someone earlier, actually. Companies used to compete with companies. Now supply chains compete with supply chains. And for that reason, we need to have a much more resilient focus in order for us to compete more effectively. ASCM does an annual report, and we look at the top trends in supply chain. So what is a trend? A trend is something that we think is happening now and also going to happen into the future as well. So we do this every year, and it's really interesting to see the changes that we come across in each of these trends. Who wants to take a guess at the 1, 2, or 3 biggest ranking trend at the moment? Any guesses? Any guesses? Shireen? AI, okay. Machine learning, all right, that's cool, that's a good guesses. Okay. Well, you're right. AI is the top trend that we have come across. And sorry to mention it again, because I know AI we talk about all the time. But AI is definitely the #1 trend that we're seeing in terms of what supply chain executives are thinking about and what they're trying to do in their supply chains. One thing that I do want to mention here, which is true for all technologies that we implement in our supply chains, is it really starts with process first. Whether it's AI, whether it's blockchain, whether it's Internet of Things, whether it's any other technology that we're implementing, it's all about how it supports the process. And when we think about AI in supply chain management, we're not necessarily talking about ChatGPT. We're talking about bespoke products or solutions that can help us make decisions in our own supply chains with our own data. I said the word data. That is a precursor to AI being effective in our supply chains, having the master data be correct. And you'll see in some previous years, that was a very big topic that we had. The other element that we have here, number 2 rank for the top trend in supply chain in 2026, this report just came out 2 weeks ago, by the way, is global trade dynamics. We all know what's happening with the US, the tariffs, the dynamics, politics, and those things all impact us quite heavily. The global trade dynamics impact is really impactful on our supply base, it's impactful on price, and also, if we know what the tariffs are and they stay the same, that's a lot better than us having low tariffs one day, high tariffs another day, and the changes that happen frequently. So it's about predictability, I think, that makes us easier to deal with, but that's not always the case. The other one that comes up here, number 3, is automation. Automation is actually a new one that we've added to this list in the top 10. It has always been, in fact, on the list, somewhere further down the list, but automation is definitely making a big comeback now. I want to go back a step quickly and just show you the history, because machine learning was there, and you just reminded me of that. We had machine learning back in 2023 as a key trend, but machine learning has been really on a topic for a very, very long time. I can remember a decade ago where we were implementing a machine learning model in our forecasting system at the organization I was working at. So it's definitely something that's not new. And in supply chain management, we see huge applications for these types of technologies. The global trade dynamics that I just spoke about has also been on the list for quite a long time. And going back to 2023, we had logistics vulnerability, which a lot of that was caused by the trade issues that we're having and the geopolitics. As I mentioned, automation is brand new. Then agility and resilience. So these are actually, in many ways, it's the same topic, agility and resilience, but comes from the topic of risk management. And actually, we've always had this. So if you look back at the last few years, we've actually had this topic come up very, very frequently. So what does it mean if we see this all the time? Well, it's a trigger and a signal to us as supply chain professionals to adjust the way we see risk management. Risk management in the past was about doing a risk register once a year. We do the risk register, these are the risks, and then we put it in the cupboard, and then we maybe look at it again in a year's time. Now it's about continuous updates. It's about understanding the current risk, and it's about putting in place operating models that support resilience. Workforce evolution is the next one that we have, and this is number 5 on the list. So the workforce evolution is very much tied to technology. It's the evolution of the workforce to be able to work with these new technologies and actually use them for the benefit of our objectives. It has been there for a couple of years. We didn't actually have it on the list in 2023, but 2024 we started seeing the emergence of systems and people investments that organizations should be doing. It was in 2025 at number 9, and now we've seen it go up in importance again in 2026. The next one is visibility and traceability. This is really important, as has always been important, and it's now coming up quite highly, I think, at number 6 on our list over here. So understanding where our products are, especially with the nature of the risk that we are coming across, is making sure we can have some more visibility around what is happening, where is the inventory, and what are the decisions we can make around that. I'd also like to extend this topic of visibility into our S&OP process. I'm still a big fan of S&OP, even though it is now an old kind of practice that we do, but it still adds so much value because we create the visibility. At the very least, trying to anticipate what inventory we will have, and what decisions we can make that are different. It still surprises me in organizations, that especially organizations that are importing products, that Chinese New Year is always a surprise. Like, it happens every year, right? So this shouldn't be a surprise to us. But if we work very closely with an S&OP process, we'll easily be able to mitigate that and any other issue as well. Cybersecurity is a big one. Cybersecurity, and I can probably list for you 10 companies in the last year that have been victims of cyber attacks. Not only the internal data of the organization, but the data of their clients, their employees, and also information that should not be out there. This is a very interesting one for me because when we look at supply chain maturity levels, and we study this with a lot of organizations, we've actually broken it into 5 different steps. The step that goes from internal alignment to external alignment is usually a very hard bridge to cross. And the key reason for that is the trust of the data, sharing of data and being able to say, my data is safe. As I mentioned in the beginning, we're now talking about supply chain competitiveness and not necessarily company competitiveness. But that requires information sharing. So this is a challenge, not only because we see the impact of cyber risks and what happens when data gets stolen or lost, but also the impact of how we integrate that information between different channel partners. A new one that's actually just come up is cost optimization. We didn't see this before. We could assume that cost optimization was kind of there at the point at always, right? We always want to save cost, but it does seem like it's becoming a key focus area for supply chain professionals now. Agile and dynamic sourcing talks a lot to agility and resilience, being able to change between different options or channel partners. This is dependent on the supply chain strategy that we want to employ. If we want our supply chain to be more agile, that means we're going to have to make a decision around the number of suppliers and compare that to the cost, economies of scale and the cost that we would typically have if we have only one supplier. So there's key decisions that we need to make around agility and being able to change our sourcing policies and processes very quickly. And then the last one there is climate and circularity. This one has been an interesting one over the years. If I look at climate and circularity, it actually fell off the radar in 2025. We want it to be higher, but it is on the agenda, and I think it will always be on the agenda, but a lot of the time there's other aspects that fall on top of that. One key thing that we see in all the companies that we work with is, I'd say 95% of the time, when a circularity or a sustainable supply chain initiative is put in place, let's say solar panels on the roof of your factory, for example, it's usually to do with a cost saving as well. There's almost always a cost element or a regulatory element. It's required by regulation to do, or there's a cost that is impacted there. So this is also important from a regulation perspective, but of course, if it can help your cost, then this is something to do as well. Quickly, some others to mention. Big data and analytics fell off the list. Doesn't mean it's not important. I would almost say that we're probably covering that a little bit under the visibility and traceability piece, but it does not mean that it's not important, but this has been a very big topic of discussion. The other one is digital supply chains. So digital twins, looking at supply chain services as well. And actually recently, when we changed the score model and updated it about a year and a half ago, instead of using the word make or manufacture, we're using the word transform. Because we're now changing from one form to another, and we can do that with technology and we can do that with data as well, right? So that we do have the digital supply chains too. Some others, robotics, that comes up a lot as well. It's on the list, but not top 10. And smart logistics, Internet of Things. And finally, essential goods supply chains. So if you think back to 2023, 2020, what was happening then, of course, the essential goods supply chains were becoming quite important at that point in time. So what can we do with this information? Well, it's really important to understand how this impacts our own supply chains. And I always take a step back here. We always need to think about what it is that the supply chain that we've defined, or that we've scoped out, has to achieve. There are two key things that has to happen in a supply chain. One is to make sure the customer gets the service they need. We improve customer service and reduce cost. Usually those are the two things we need to think about. But there's elements below that that can also impact that. So the next topic I want to go into a little bit more is when we think about these words here, attributes. What is an attribute? An attribute is an element of the supply chain that is a strategic direction. If we could define a strategy in one word, this would be it. Reliability, responsiveness, and agility. These things are not the same. Reliability, responsiveness, and agility are elements that relate to the customer. These are external-facing attributes. Cost, profit, and asset management, more internal-facing attributes, and then environmental and social attributes as well. When we think about reliability, it's very much related to consistency. We said we would deliver the product on Monday, and guess what? The product gets there on Monday. That's reliability. It doesn't mean that we deliver it quickly. It just means that we do what we said we would do. There's different aspects that relate to this, and when we get to the metric, you'll see that. But it's really about the right quantity of products at the right time, with the correct documentation as well, and also they cannot be damaged. So they must be perfect quality as well when those products are delivered. That's what we mean when we say reliability. An example of that is in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry. You would sacrifice cost if it meant that you could get the product to the patient on time because it's life-saving medication, right? So that would be an example where we would definitely be aiming for reliability. Responsiveness is speed. Responsiveness is how quickly we get it to the customer. There are supply chains that responsiveness is important for, like in e-commerce. As customers demand quicker lead times, quicker turnaround times, when we place the order, I'm going to get my Amazon delivery by tomorrow, if somebody can do it faster than us, they might have the competitive advantage. This is an example where responsiveness is important. Then agility. Agility is key when we think about resilience. Agility is how quickly we can adapt to an unanticipated change in our supply chain. So it's the speed at which we adapt, right? And we can recover from that issue. Obviously, cost is self-explanatory, but it's about the total supply chain management cost, not necessarily only the cost of goods. It's how much it costs us to run our supply chain, how much it costs in planning, the warehousing, storing of product, transportation, and all those other elements that exist. Profit is also an important one, ensuring that our supply chain decisions relate to overall financial performance and not just the cost reduction. And I would challenge any S&OP to include profit as an element of their forecast, right? Not just how many units are we going to need in February next year, but also what will be the profitability of our business at that point in time. That's also where IBP, Integrated Business Planning, comes in. Asset management typically talks to how we can utilize the machinery in our organizations. So companies that are very heavy on manufacturing typically go for this. They want to get the most units out at the lowest cost, and who cares about anything else beyond manufacturing? This is typically where we see that, and also under inventory management, right? Keeping reduced inventories, in this case as well, is an example of asset management as a strategy. We also have environmental and social, and for these two, there are examples of supply chains that talk to these two attributes. Think of the United Nations, or Doctors Without Borders, or any kind of humanitarian entity that's actually doing logistics for that purpose. Cost isn't the first item there. It's something else first. It's about saving people's lives, or it's about getting food to people and things like that. And then on the environmental side, obviously the impact aligned to sustainability, and also very much to regulation and national targets as well. These are some of the metrics that we typically use when we think about these strategic attributes. And these are level 1 metrics, we call them, because you have level 2 and even level 3 metrics below these. This is straight out of the SCORE framework, actually. So imagine deciding a strategy for your supply chain, and then, as a next step, determining the key metric that we want to measure, and of course then going down from there. So this helps us define what that strategy is going to be. We can choose our strategy, and this is always where a lot of companies get stuck. Because they'll say to me, I want to be good at everything. I want to be reliable and cost-effective and responsive and agile, and all of them must be the best in class. But I'm sorry to tell you that's unrealistic. Because supply chain is about trade-offs. So we need to make a choice. That does not mean that we abandon the other attributes. It just means that we develop a supply chain that can handle that specific attribute. So if we chose, let's say we were a healthcare and pharmaceutical organization. Our goal is to get products to the hospitals for life-saving medication. We might choose reliability to be the superior metric here. And now let's force ourselves to choose other metrics or other attributes, but we can only choose 2 of them. So let's say responsiveness and cost could be at an advantage level, and everything else is going to be at parity. So what do I mean by that? This means that if we look at our competitors and we look at similar other supply chains in a similar industry to us, we would want to be superior to them in reliability. That makes sense when we look at being competitive, because we're going to compete with those other entities and hopefully be better than them at delivering the service that the customer needs from a reliability perspective. To take this one step further, this is an example of a level 1 scorecard, supply chain operations reference, not score as in SCORE. What we've done here is compare an organization with these key level 1 metrics to other similar organizations out there. And really what we're trying to do is get a sense of where do we sit compared to them. This is a very good starting point to analyze your supply chain. What should the target be for on time in full? What should the target be for inventory days of supply? We can determine some of that by looking at other people and other entities that are doing similar stuff to us. So this is a very good way to do that. If we want to be the best in class, we need to be at a certain level, which would be 90% or more of the best in class for that industry. This is just an example of a scorecard like that. Now we move into operating model. So an operating model are the decisions and the policies that we have for each aspect of our supply chain. Let's think back to our example there, reliability. We want to be reliable. So now we need to determine what would make sourcing reliable, what would make our order process reliable, our fulfillment process, returns, transform, etc. This is the SCORE framework at level 1. And there's an example of, this is an actual example of an organization in the pharmaceutical industry that looked at how they could best align to their strategy. So one example of what they did was, they said, we want to be very reliable. And in order for us to do that, we cannot have just 1 or 2, 3 sources of supply. We need to have multiple options of supply for packaging, for raw materials, for products that we need. So their strategy, which is intentional, was to have multiple suppliers and not just one. But they sacrificed cost because they're not going to get economies of scale from just one supplier, but we have more options. That's a decision that we made. Another example is within plan. When we think of the planning function and the forecasting function, this organization said, well, our forecasting depends very heavily on what the customer needs or what the customer tells us. So we need to develop a process that has a very high touch and connection to our customer. In this case, it was an internal customer. That is a decision that we make for the process. If it's a commoditized item, we can just do a historic forecast, say, yes, this is what it's going to be, extrapolate it into the future and not do that piece. But that's a key decision point that we'd want to make. Here's an example of what we mentioned, a benefits statement. So this would be looking at where we are currently as an organization. And then what you see here is different projects or initiatives that have their own objectives and have their own timelines in order to achieve a certain goal. We must quantify what we want to do. So this metric is a metric called expired stock items as a percentage of total active and inactive items. Okay, it's a specific internal metric. We have got the current state here of 8.2%. Our target is 1%. how are we going to get to that 1%? There's different options that we can use to get there, and measuring to what degree each of these elements is going to do that. So this becomes extremely practical, right, when we really think about what we want to achieve. And then finally, I want to talk about what we call the score racetrack. Now, it's going to sound very common, right? A lot of supply chain organizations, consultants will go down a similar journey, I'd say. But really what we're trying to do here is get alignment on the company, get alignment on the supply chain objectives, and ensure that we can follow through. So engage and define are key topics that are very important here. Engage with the correct people. I know it sounds like a cliche, but I can absolutely say for a fact that usually the people are the constraint and the people are the solution sometimes. So really, that's the important part. Defining the strategic business priorities. Think about your own organizations. Do you know what your strategic priority is for each of your supply chains? Have you even segmented your supply chains? Maybe you have cold chain, you have an ambient supply chain, you have different types of supply chains which have their own objectives. That's the key thing that we do and define. And then analyze. The score mark, the benchmarking that I showed you is a key input into that. You can do root cause analysis, you can do a disconnect analysis. Disconnect means a disconnect in the process, and defect means a gap in the performance. Root cause analysis, right? Going deep into understanding that. That's what you do and analyze. Throughout this journey, you need to find opportunities and need to find solutions. We're not in this framework talking about operational supply chain. I don't care if somebody helped us to get the product from from the supplier when it was late. Yes, great, well done. But what we want to do is fix the problem. We want to develop the supply chain to be able to not have that problem in the first place. In the plan phase, this is about creating a portfolio of improvement initiatives. Also, again, think about your own supply chains. Internally, do we have initiatives in place? What are we doing? Is the demand planner just moving numbers, or is the demand planner improving forecast accuracy? That is a different mindset, and that's what we're trying to do here. Under the launch piece, this is where accountability comes in. Every initiative that we have in an organization should have an accountable element to it. Somebody needs to take ownership for that being achieved, right? We're not just there to do operational things and hope that an order comes in and then fulfill the order. That's a low level of maturity in an organization. So thank you so much for your time today. Contact me on LinkedIn, and if you do, we can offer you a free assessment, maturity assessment in your supply chain using the SCORE framework. And also, we have got our latest report out, ASCM's Top 10 Trends report, where if you're in any way skeptical of how we got to those answers, it'll explain exactly how we got there and the methodology around that. Very interesting report. Thank you so much for your time today, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. Stay.